All right. Hello, everybody. This is Keith Siska from Last Call Bar Academy, and I'm here with some LSAT studiers. And today we're going to talk about predicting answers on the LR section. And what prompted this was that one of my students who's here today at Sheba was discussing that issue in the group in the LSAT forum. And she had expressed that we taught her in our class that you shouldn't try to predict answers. And when I read that, I jumped in right away because I think that predicting answers is a very large part of my strategy. And so I wanted to correct and say, no, I think you should predict answers. But when a student of mine demonstrates some confusion, I always try to internalize that and figure out, why have I confused the student? Why wasn't that message clear in my teachings? And so I think one of the difficulties in predicting answers is that you can sometimes do it very accurately and other times you can't. And so you have to know which is which and when to try to do it and when to be a little less aggressive about doing it. And so I've created a slideshow where I'm going to talk about half a dozen question types or so. And there's at least twice as many as that in the LR section. So I won't be able to discuss all of the question types today. I think I can create a second follow-up lesson to this and present it next week sometime and go through the rest of the questions. But here's the ones that I want to start talking about. These question types fall into two different, what I call families of questions. The logic family of questions will present an argument in the stimulus, and then the question is probing the logic of that argument. The next family of questions that I want to discuss are the flaw family questions. Those I view as an extension of the logic family, because this series of questions is asking you about the logic, but it's also asking you about why or how the logic is flawed. And so you're not just analyzing the logic at that point, you're going a step further and saying, okay, if that's the logic, what's wrong with it? Why is it bad logic? So I'm going to start by talking about the main point, method of reasoning, and role questions. Those are all in the logic family. It doesn't matter what the flaw is. You just have to understand the logic of the argument, and then you predict your answer and go to the answer choices. Whereas with the flaw family questions, flaw, assumption questions, strengthen, weaken, evaluate, and the principle questions, recognizing the logic isn't going far enough. You'd be better off if you identified the logic and identified the flaw of the argument, because that will give you some ammunition for grappling with the answer choices. And that's the kind of prediction that I'm talking about. And I want to be a little more granular today about what exactly should you be predicting. All right, Andy, you want to jump in with a question?
Yeah, no, this is just super quick. And this is just like it just popped into my head. So for some reason, like I find the logic family easy, or excuse me, I find the flaw, like those two groups that you just had. Is it like common to think that the flaw questions would be easier? Like I don't mean the actual flaw question type, like that group that you just had, easier than the group that you had above it, the logic type questions.
It sounds a little unusual to me because I view identifying flaws as an additional step. But given that many of the resources on the market are so emphasize flaws so heavily and give you lists of fallacies and drills on recognizing flaws, it's not that surprising to me that you've developed a negative skill, identifying the negatives of the logic, and the affirmative skill has suffered. In fact, I've talked about this in the forum quite a bit. I've said that the materials out there have tainted people's thinking into believing that everything's a flaw. The one that I hate the most is cause correlation flaw. Correlation doesn't equal causation. It's true. But because that's presented as a flaw over and over and over again, it leads students, I think, to the incorrect assumption that correlation is not a proper way to debate or argue causation. Correlation is essential to a good causal argument. It's the first step, and it's a huge step in making the causal claim. So it's not that it's irrelevant or it's bad to think about causation and correlation in the same argument. It's just that it's insufficient. There are two additional prongs of the causal reasoning that aren't satisfied by the correlation alone. And so I think by pointing out flaws over and over and over again, what the materials are failing to do is teach students how to construct arguments affirmatively. What does a good argument look like? If you were going to fix these flawed arguments, how would you do it? Most students are sort of unable to answer those questions because they can only identify the flaw, and they don't have the skills to see, well, what would be the correct form of the argument. I want to talk about that a little bit today because my approach is very different. My opinion is finding the flaw before you understand the logic is backward. And I know that the materials teach you to do that. I'm not criticizing your approach. It's just, if I were creating a strategy, which I'm trying to write a strategy book, it would be the reverse. It would be build the logic, construct the logic first, then find the flaw in the argument. So let's come back to that when we get to the flaw family questions. All right, as I mentioned before, some answers can be predicted very accurately. I blow students' minds sometimes because I'll read the argument and say, oh, well, the correct answer must be blah, 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 blah. And then they're like, wait, have you seen the question before? I mean, you were 2 words away from the correct answer. And then there's other questions where I will tell the student as we're reading the question, I have no idea. There's so many different ways they could strengthen this argument that for me to try to predict one in particular would be harmful to get that granular and then look for that one thing when there's 100 others that could be potential contenders. So I don't always try to predict answers verbatim. And I want to talk today about how I know when to do it and when not to do it. The first thing is that this is a skill that I've developed. It's not like I was just born predicting answers. I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of LSAT questions. And I mean, that's step number one. Be committed to very deep study of the test because the language is extremely sophisticated and you're never going to master it with simplistic algorithms or heuristics. It's always going to entail deep, deep analytical study of the words and the syntax. The other thing is that when you're using process of elimination and using other people's explanations, checking your own answers, what you're not doing is manipulating the language. You're just relying on other people to provide the language for you, and you give it the thumbs up or the thumbs down. To really build verbal dexterity, I have an exercise that I teach with as part of my triple review study method, where you take the questions that you got wrong on LR and you rewrite your wrong answers into correct answers. Change the syntax or the wording of those wrong answers. And if you can't do it, what I tell my students is that if you can't change your wrong answer into a right one, you still don't understand why you got it wrong. You should be able to, right? If you really have good verbal skills, what's stopping you from saying, here's what's wrong with that answer choice, and here's what would fix it. Here's what would make it right. So that's an exercise that I do with many of my students. They hate me because every time they ask me, will you explain this LR question to me? I do it. But the caveat is always, I'm going to flip it back on the student and tell me, now you tell me how to fix your wrong answer. I'll always explain the right one. I'll even tell you what's wrong with the one you picked. But what I typically won't do, or at least not until the student has attempted it, is try to fix that wrong answer because that robs the student of the opportunity to practice speaking the language. You don't master Spanish by just reading Spanish. At some point, you have to start speaking it. Even if you're saying it wrong, you have to start saying it wrong and have someone correct you. And that's what I want them to do. I want them to say, is it this? Say it wrong and I'll correct it. And if they get it right, even better. But they have to start the process of verbalizing, articulating, and that's what that exercise is intended to teach. So if you're interested in the wrong answer game, it's part of strategy review, strategy planning in the triple review study method. I'd love to to chat with you guys more about that in some future session. I believe strongly in triple review, and so I talk about it all the time. All right, let's talk more about predicting answers on LR. Why should you bother doing it? Why not just use process of elimination? I think I myself would have made this argument at one point in my development because I was so good at LR that it seemed like the path to getting better was perfecting what I was already doing. What I was doing was reading and reading the stimulus, reading the question, reading the answer choices, and then using a very high degree of intuition, eliminating the ones that seemed wrong, debating the remaining answers, and just picking the one I liked, essentially. But that's not a method to get better. And the way that I like to describe that approach, where you're just eliminating all the answers, reading every answer choice, is that it's a brute force approach that consumes a ton of mental energy. You have to fully read and interpret every single answer choice in its entirety in order to relay it back to the stimulus and figure out if it's right or wrong. So what I learned after tutoring LSAT for a year or two is that I started to be able to predict the answers before looking at the answer choices. And it turned out to be a shortcut. I'll explain what I mean by a shortcut in a minute. Another benefit of predicting answers is that it helps you avoid clever traps. So when my students want to look at the answers without a prediction, sometimes I ask them this: what are you looking for? How will you know? If we read an answer, how will you know if it's correct or not? And of course, I know the answer to it. They're just going to see if they like it. It's intuition is what they want to do. Intuition feels good. It doesn't require a lot of work. And honestly, I'm a big fan of intuition. I think the human brain is remarkably adept at finding patterns and utilizing intuition, but you have to feed information into your intuition on its off hours when you're studying and you're not taking time tests. And intuition works best when you use it with a sound process. The reason for that is that mental multitasking harms your intellectual proficiency. I did a presentation on that last week. And so if you guys go back and watch my YouTube videos from last week, I did one about mental multitasking and why it's bad. Intuition will work well if you can break down your strategy into a series of steps and then allow your intuition to work on each individual step separately instead of one grand puzzle where it's just come to me solution, right? Take a series of steps to get there instead, and then your intuition will be a much more powerful tool. All right, another thing is that predicting answers is a way to make reading more active and more fun. I can't tell you how many people tell me they find the LSAT to be boring, dry, and technical, and they check out and frequently don't understand what they're reading. And for me, it's the exact opposite. I find it to be fascinating and difficult to break away from. It's distracting to me. The LSAT itself is a distraction away from my, other things that I have going on at home. And part of the reason that I find it to be so fun is that I'm not reading it like a sponge to absorb information. It's not passive. It's a game for me. I'm trying to predict where they're going with every single stimulus. I want to know the answer before I look at the answer choice because it's fun and because it helps me get questions right. And so then the last point that I want to make is that in law school, you will not take many multiple choice exams. At some point, the burden does shift to you to be able to verbalize the logic, verbalize the arguments, and to do so soundly, or to be able to articulate the problems with arguments that you're rejecting. And if all you've done for your LSAT prep is choose and eliminate, then that won't help you develop the verbal dexterity that will help you succeed in law school. And that's why I'm such a big fan of that wrong answer game and triple review, because I think that it not only improves your LSAT score, but I think it also preps you for law school, and it tries to develop the skills that the LSAT was intended to test, rather than an end run around those skills, a trick so that we don't have to learn the skill. I'm not in favor of tricks. Okay, so how do we make predictions? That's really what you guys care about. The first thing that you have to understand is that LR is based on deductive logic. I truly didn't understand that for many years that I studied the LSAT. It seems almost silly to say it, but when they say, why is the argument flawed? What's wrong with the argument? It never occurred to me to say, by what standard? Who gets to say which arguments are good, which arguments are bad, and if they're bad, what's wrong with them? It took me a long time to figure out that the standard is the standard of deductive logic, the same standard that applies on logic games. That blew my mind. All of a sudden, logic games made a lot of sense. Logic games is the precursor to LR. Logic games is the valid logic. LR, they break the rules, but they're requiring you, or they expect you to apply the same rules from logic games, and then understand why they failed to apply the rules. Right? Where did they go wrong in applying the logic game rules? So in that sense, the LR section is testing logic, not facts. And most of the questions in the flaw family and the logic family are probing the validity of the logic of the argument, not the truth of the premises. I have students occasionally tell me I didn't choose this or I did choose that, because usually it's I didn't choose it, because I think that's very unlikely. It's implausible for that to be true. It makes no difference whether you find something to be implausible or unfactual. What matters is whether you can take the statements as they're given to you, pretend like they're true, and then understand how they connect logically to create further deductions. It's really an exercise in suspended disbelief. Pretend like all of this is true. It's like the logic game. You've never read a logic game and said to me, I don't think A really comes before B in this situation. That rule is false. That would be absurd, right? To debate the rules of the logic game. The same thing applies to LR. It's absurd to debate the premises, because they're not asking you about the facts. They're asking you about the logic. They're asking you to take those premises and then determine what conclusions you can draw from them. And if you can't draw the conclusion that they've given you, why not? What's missing? The first step really to learning to spot flaws, I think, is learning how to make valid deductive arguments. And then you can compare the flawed argument to the valid form. Here's the analogy that I like to give people. Finding the flaw in an argument is like finding the missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle. You get the jigsaw puzzle in a box. It's disassembled in a random order. That's analogous to the way that they present LR stimuli. They're not always in a logical order. They give you these series of sentences. One is the conclusion. It's not always at the beginning. It's not always at the end. It's not always clear where it is. You have to hunt for it. So if we have this box, the jigsaw puzzle in the box, and it's missing a piece, right? That's the flaw in the argument. It's a missing piece of the puzzle. But if I ask you which piece is missing, it's extraordinarily difficult to tell with all the pieces disassembled in the box. And that's basically what I think the test gimmicks are asking you to do. They're saying, here's a trick for finding the missing piece of the puzzle. If you look at all the edges first, maybe you'll find it. If you, I don't know what other tricks you could have for finding it, but basically their tricks involve keeping the puzzle disassembled and just brute forcing, finding that one piece that's missing. I take the opposite approach. I say, let's put the puzzle together. And then it will be silly to even ask which piece is missing, because the picture of the logic will be so clear that the missing piece of the puzzle stands out. You don't have to debate what's wrong with it. We see what's wrong with it. We have the logic going to here, and then there's a gap. It doesn't connect to here. I actually do some visual diagrams, which I'll show you guys a little later in today's session. So learning how to make valid arguments is step one. How do you make valid arguments? Well, the syllogistic form that we have from the ancient Greeks involves minor premise, major premise. That's the form that I use when I think about deductive logic. Minor premises are facts about the subject of the conclusion. Major premises are rules that allow us to get to the predicate of the conclusion. I'll give you an example, the famous Socrates is mortal example on a later slide. And then once I've organized the premises, once I know which ones are the minor premises, which ones are the major premises, then I start putting the puzzle together. Where do the concepts overlap from premise to premise? And I draw a chain. Here's how the logic proceeds. We start with this idea, we connect it to that one, we connect it to the third one, we get to the fourth one, and that fourth one, now we're back to the predicate of the conclusion. There's the full chain that starts from the beginning of the conclusion to the end of the conclusion. Or more likely, there's a gap somewhere in that chain, and that's what's going to become interesting as we do the flaw family questions. All right, let's see. We've got something in the chat. Do I only do this untimed is Andy's question. No. I perfect this untimed, but the models that I teach people for LR are descriptions of what I'm visualizing in my head when I do the argument. I really am thinking about connections, logic, validity, gaps. It all happens instantaneously. It's intuitive, but it's intuitive because I've paused and done hundreds of arguments really slowly. And so I know the different combinations. I know how to piece together and organize the premises. It's kind of like learning scales on an instrument. You don't start blazing fast. You start really, really painstakingly slow. But if you do it over and over and over, that muscle memory, that intuition starts to kick in. And if you use a really organized process to guide your intuition, that's what I was getting at before, eventually you can do all of these steps subconsciously, intuitively, without calling them out and articulating every point along the way. I'll give you some examples as we go. I have a picture later on that will show you how I visualize the gaps before I put it into words. Because I don't always put everything into words. I might know that there's a flaw, but I'll think, I'll come back and deal with that if and when I need to. I'll just for now kind of identify, here's the gap. I don't really know what syntax would fill that gap, but it may not be relevant if there's more than one gap. Let me come back to that point. All right, main point questions I consider to be sort of the most simplistic question form. If you're getting these wrong, Andy said that sometimes the logic family questions are easier than the flaw family ones. What you may need to do is insert a process that simplifies the steps a little more. Instead of just trying to intuit the main point, have a series of steps to double check and make sure you've found the main point. Have a step to paraphrase it before you go to the answer choices. All right, so here's what I do on main point questions. I'm going to get more granular now. What kind of prediction are we looking for? On main point questions, the main point is the conclusion of the argument. So my first order of business is to find the conclusion. And in the spirit of not multitasking, I make that my exclusive focus. That is all I'm thinking about for the first 30 seconds is what are the transition words, which ideas support which sentence or which clause do I think is the main conclusion, and I underline it and I double check it if it's a main point question. I can't be wrong here. So I'll look at the other sentences. Could this be a subsidiary conclusion? Are they trying to trick me? Is there a premise that supports what I think is the conclusion? I'm really deliberate about making sure that I identify the conclusion correctly. The next thing that I do is I spend a moment paraphrasing it, especially if they've described a relationship that could be described from the opposite perspective. A is greater than B. I'm expecting the correct answer to say B is smaller, less than A. They're never going to give it to me verbatim. Very rarely will the correct answer to a main point question be a quote of the text. So rather than waiting for the argument to give me some obscure paraphrase that's hard for me to match, I start paraphrasing first. I simplify the conclusion, I get it into a framework that I'm really happy with, or I understand it. It's the language that's comfortable for me. And then I go to the answer choices, having thought about those relationships from a couple different perspectives. That way, whatever paraphrase they choose to invoke isn't going to come out of left field. I've anticipated a couple different options for that paraphrase. Sometimes there's an obvious thing, a comparison, usually look at the comparison from the opposite angle. In other cases, there's no obvious paraphrase. You just need to kind of simplify a complex statement to make sure you get the essence of it. But that's how I predict the answer to a main point question. I find the conclusion, and then I spend 10 or 15 seconds reformulating it into different ways. How could I say that same thing a couple different ways? What are the synonyms of those words that I might find in the correct answer here? All right, the next question type gets a little trickier, the reasoning questions. These are the ones that ask you, how did the argument work? Well, the argument is designed to support the conclusion, so you're not going to be able to articulate the inner workings of the argument if you don't know the conclusion. That's always step one for all of the logic questions, all of the flaw family questions. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, since I don't want to multitask, I truly try not to get ahead of myself. I'm not trying to describe the reasoning. I'm trying to find the conclusion and underline it and understand it, paraphrase it, make sure I get the main point of the argument. Once I'm very confident about my comprehension of the conclusion, then I go back and reflect on the premises a second time. Where are they? Which sentences support that conclusion? Now, when they ask you about the reasoning of the argument, what they're really asking you to do is to generalize the argument, right? The reasoning isn't specific to the content. It's not about that country and that specific instance. It's about how does this argument work in a way that other arguments might work. So your first step toward predicting the answer is to generalize the premises. When I say generalize, I mean to ask, what kind of statements are they in general? Get rid of all the specific content and just talk about what type of statement is that? Is it conditional? Is it past tense? Is it present tense? Is it describing a statistical correlation? Is it a rule or a principle or just a fact? Is it used as an example? An example would be a specific instance of a broader concept. If we can pinpoint what kind of premises we're working with, we're starting to make progress in describing the reasoning of the argument. And then the last step, generalize the conclusion, right? If we're going to generalize the premises, we can generalize the conclusion too. What kind of statement is it? Is it conditional? Is it causal? I also like to look at the tense. Is it a prediction? Very often, the premises are past tense and then the conclusion's future tense. Or better yet, is the conclusion prescriptive? Not only future tense, but it's not even predictive or descriptive. It's telling us what we should do, how to solve a problem going forward. So I try to really look at the general components, the logical components of the premises and the conclusion, and extract them away from the specific content of that argument. Okay, role questions. These are the questions where they say, what is the role being played by this particular statement in the argument? The first thing that I do for those, like all of the logic family questions, I find the conclusion. I'm not even thinking about that sentence they asked me about because its role has to be in comparison to the conclusion. The conclusion is the most important thing in the argument. I can't understand the purpose of anything else in the argument if I don't know the conclusion of the argument. So step number one, find the conclusion, underline the conclusion, paraphrase the conclusion. That's always my first step toward understanding an argument. In fact, I think that keying in on the conclusion is so important. I actually physically underline it, even given the sort of poor digital interface that LSAC has given us. I do it as a visual anchor because I'm probably going to forget the conclusion at some point. I'm probably going to have to go back and remind myself what the conclusion is. And I'm probably going to have to do it quickly. So I want to have that visual anchor so I can find those concepts quickly. But okay, once I've identified the conclusion, then I find the statement that they've asked me about in the question, the referenced statement. And what the question means when they say, what is the role of that statement? What they're really asking you is, what is the relationship between that statement and the conclusion of the argument? Sometimes it is the conclusion of the argument. That's my first sub bullet point. It's the conclusion. Okay, good. Main point, conclusion. Sometimes it's not the conclusion, then it could be a premise that directly supports the conclusion. Or that statement could be a subsidiary conclusion, which then supports the main conclusion. Or it could be a premise that supports the subsidiary conclusion, or maybe something else entirely that doesn't fit neatly into the logical stream of the argument. It could be a counterposition or a concession. That's something else is sort of the hardest of the batch to really deal with. So that's how I pre-phrase answers to role questions. I'm really looking at, is it the conclusion? And if not, what relationship does it have with the conclusion? Does it support the conclusion? And if so, how so? Directly, indirectly? And if not, well, then what stance does it take with respect to the conclusion? Does it counter it completely? Or is it just a concession? Okay, next question type. I don't want to talk about parallel reasoning questions, even though I consider them to be part of the logic family. They involve some nuanced skills. It's an advanced question type that, predicting those answers requires a little deftness. You have to be good at predicting the other questions first, I think. Flaw questions are really important, though, and this is maybe where the discussion came up in the forum. I think that being able to predict answers to flaw questions is like a harbinger of your success for the entire section, because so many of the question types are really getting at what is the flaw of the argument. All the strengthen, weaken, assumption questions, all of those pertain to the flaw of the argument. So if you can read the argument and say the flaw is, you have a huge lead on the correct answer toward 60 or 70% of the LR question types. I call it taking the first step. I can't predict the answer verbatim to some of these questions, but what I can do is get halfway there. And then when I read the correct answer, it's easier to take that last step and say, yes, I see how that connects, rather than trying to connect the answer all the way back to the difficult language of the original argument. So I take the first step toward the correct answer and then compare that to the answer choices. Okay, so for flaw questions, any flawed argument is flawed because it's not deductively valid. All that means is that the premises don't prove the conclusion, even if they're true. I want to make that really clear, that you can't debate the premises themselves. The point is that even if the premises are true, we still don't get to the conclusion. And what's really interesting is, why not? Why don't we get there even if I concede all the points you want me to make? Step one to finding the flaw is the same as all the other questions we've talked about. You have to be absolutely correct about the conclusion. If you're wrong about the conclusion, you're almost surely going to articulate the flaw incorrectly. So I find it, underline it, paraphrase it. Next, I construct what I call the affirmative logic. I don't want to think about the flaw yet. Thinking about the flaw prematurely might cause me to attack a portion of the argument that's actually sound. So what I need to do first is figure out what's good about this argument. And the way that I do that is by reordering the premises. I organize them differently. Instead of thinking about the premises in the order that they're given to me, I think about them in terms of which of the premises are about the subject of the conclusion and which of the premises are about the predicate of the conclusion. Right now we're going all the way back to grammar. You have to be really good with English syntax and grammar to execute this kind of advanced strategy. But if you understand how to segregate the conclusion into a subject and a predicate, you have an immediate map for the argument. Some of the premises will be about the subject, some will be about the predicate. In a really simple argument, that's it. That's the whole argument. You have to get to some really complex arguments where you have linking premises that don't actually connect to the conclusion itself. They just connect other premises together. But for the simplest arguments, really, the organizational principle is as simple as which premises are about the subject and which premises are about the predicate. And in the simplest argument, it's one major premise, one minor premise. We'll get into that a little more if we have time. It's only after putting all the premises and organizing them logically that I start looking for the gaps. Once I see all of the proper connections that are made from premise to premise, it's easier for me to identify, well, which premises are not properly connected, which ones don't overlap cleanly with the concept in the next premise or in the conclusion. Once I know that gap, I can predict the answer to any flaw question. The flaw is that they went from idea A to idea B without the necessary premise to get there. And we can state that, grappling with the language of the answer choices, we can always state any flaw in several different ways. One is as an assumption. The argument assumes that there is a connection between A and B. They didn't connect them in the argument, so they assumed that they are connected. Or the argument fails to consider that maybe those ideas are not connected. A and B don't connect or overlap the way that the argument assumes they do. If you understand the language of the answer choices of the flaw questions, that helps you to grapple with the fact that the answer choices are diametrically opposed. They're negations of one another. The answer choices that begin with assumes, presumes, takes for granted, all of those are introducing affirmative assumptions of the argument. Whereas the answer choices that start with fails to consider, overlooks the possibility, those are introducing negations of those assumptions, weakeners of the argument. And if you're not really good at interpreting that language of the answer choices itself, you might have done everything correct up to that point and then still missed the question. What amazes me about this, I find this highly amusing. Sometimes I'll have a tutoring student ask me about a flaw question, and we'll get to an answer that they're struggling with, and it'll say, well, the argument fails to consider blah, blah, blah. And I'll say to them, okay, tell me what that means for the argument to fail to consider something. It's rare that a student can give me a straight answer to that. Or I'll say, what does it mean for the argument to presume or take something for granted? It's rare that a student gives me a good answer to that question. And I sort of scratch my head. I think, you saw that phrase here. You saw that phrase in the next answer choice. You saw that phrase in every flaw question you've ever done. You never thought to look it up? Never thought to question, what does that phrase mean? If a phrase appears repeatedly on the LSAT over and over and over, every test you take, get the dictionary out and look it up, please. They're not playing around with those phrases. You have to know their meaning. So I think that's one of the biggest problems with flaw questions, is that not only are they very challenging, but I think that the introductions to the answer choices are not well understood by most test takers, and they don't ever bother to pause and say, what does it mean to take something for granted? What does it mean to presume something without providing justification? If you understand that, then you understand what a necessary assumption is. In other words, a flaw question is a necessary assumption question. They're not different question types. Some of the answers to a flaw question are phrased as necessary assumptions. Furthermore, a flaw question is a weakened question because some of the answer choices are phrased as statements that would be correct answers to a weakened question. If you can do flaw questions, you've got 3 question types locked up. I think this is really the key. to being good at the LSAT. And that's why I spend so much time talking about flaw questions. But let's do a couple other question types just to give you guys a little more insight into which questions you can predict carefully and accurately and which ones you have to take a step back and say, I can't make that prediction quite so cleanly. Necessary and sufficient assumption questions are ones where I'm often verbatim, spot on correct about the answer. I read the argument, I say, I think the answer is going to be blah, blah, blah. And then the answer is exactly that, very, very often. Here's how I do it. The assumption of the argument is the flaw. It's the missing premise required to make the argument valid. So step one to finding the flaw, just like on the flaw questions, you have to find the conclusion and you have to be right and you have to be concrete about your thinking of the conclusion, particularly if you're going to organize the premises around it, subject, predicate, etc. Next thing I do, construct the affirmative logic, just like I do for a flaw question. What's good about this argument? Once I have the puzzle put together, I can see the gaps. Here are the concepts that were not well connected for this flow or this chain of logic. Now, when you find those gaps, the assumption is whatever statement, whatever words, whatever syntax would fill that gap, whatever would get you from idea A to idea B. And that's tricky. You know, it depends. That's where you have to go back to the content. It depends what we're talking about. How do we get from A to B? It's different for economics than it is from science, than it is for causation. I mean, so you can do some very general work with flaws, but then ultimately, when you're dealing with necessary and sufficient assumption questions, it all comes crashing back down to the content of the argument. How are you supposed to connect those two concepts? So I find the two concepts. That's step one. And then I start to think about which sentence or which syntax would connect the gap, fill the gap, if you will. The tricky thing, okay, let me say one more thing about assumptions. What I think that is missing from most of the materials out there is the overlap between necessary and sufficient assumptions. All of the materials are very good at telling you the difference between the two. I haven't seen a single book that tells you how they're the same. For every flawed argument, maybe not everyone, but typically for a flawed argument, there is one perfect articulation of the flaw that is both necessary and sufficient. I don't think that wasn't clear to me when I was first studying necessary and sufficient assumptions. And so I don't even think of these as different question types. I think of them as the same. And my prediction for both question types is the perfect assumption. What would be the piece of information, the sentence that we can't do without, but would also completely fill the gap, make the argument rock solid? I mean, I try to articulate that so perfectly. I can't go one step too far and I can't go one step not far enough. It has to be really perfect, the exact articulation to fix the argument. And that's how I get the answer to these questions verbatim, predicted very, very often. Because the truth is that for both question types, the answer is usually what I've called here the perfect assumption, the assumption that's both necessary and sufficient to the argument. 50, 60, 70% of the assumption questions, I've nailed it. Whatever I said is really close to the right answer. But occasionally, 20 or 30% of the questions, whatever I said, that perfect assumption, it's not in the answer choices. Now is the uh-oh moment. My prediction didn't work, right? It wasn't there. Here's where I have to start getting more granular with the question type. If it's a necessary assumption question, the reason that the answer isn't there is that I picked the perfect assumption when they asked for the necessary assumption. Necessary assumptions don't have to be sufficient. So I have to take my perfect prephrase and I have to start to back off it and say, how can I start to weaken this statement? What are the underlying assumptions embedded within that statement? What statements are subsumed by this perfect assumption? The internal, the narrower statements. And if it's a sufficient assumption question and I don't find my perfect answer, I go the opposite way. I start saying, well, how can I strengthen that prediction? And which answer choices correspond to that? Because a sufficient assumption can be stronger than necessary for the argument and still be sufficient to complete the logic. So for those question types, I actually use the exact same approach. I look for the exact same answer. I don't even think about the fact that they're different question types unless I don't find the perfect assumption. And then I start getting either more narrow or broader, depending on whether it's a necessary assumption question or a sufficient assumption question. So that's one where, my answer, I have to hedge my bets. I try to predict it verbatim. And when it works like gold. One of the answer choices is so perfect that I have 100%, 100% confidence that it's right. When it doesn't work, I have to be flexible and back off and say, okay, my prediction was good and accurate, but it wasn't the only way to articulate a necessary assumption. It wasn't the only way to articulate a sufficient assumption. And so now I have to back off the specificity of my prephrase and either go with a narrower statement or a broader statement, depending on what the situation calls for. Okay, let's go to strengthen, weaken, and evaluate questions. For these question types, this is where I think I can predict the least often. I have no idea what fact the correct answer is going to invoke to strengthen the argument. I have no idea what fact they might call upon to weaken the argument. But what I do know is that the argument must be flawed, or else we wouldn't be able to strengthen or weaken the logic of the argument. So the first thing that I do is I find the flaw, and finding the flaw requires me to find the conclusion. So step one, find the conclusion, underline it, paraphrase it. Then I start constructing the affirmative logic, because I think if I go straight for the flaw, sometimes I'm a little too hasty. I need to know, how does the argument work well? And then I can understand the contours of the gap or the flaw a little more carefully. Find the gaps. All right, now, what about my prediction? I still go through that process of finding the flaws, because the only way I can strengthen the argument is by fixing the flaws. The only way I can weaken the argument is by exploiting the flaws. So I may not be able to predict the answer with specificity, but what I can do, and this is what we were talking about in the forum, Ashiba, what I can do is predict what the correct answer will do. The correct answer must be relevant to this gap or that gap. The correct answer must tend to connect these two concepts or tend to disconnect those two concepts. I can at least identify which portions of the argument are vulnerable to being strengthened or weakened. And then when I get to the answer choices, it's true that I don't have a specific set of words in mind. I don't even have any content in mind. But what I can do is look at every single answer choice and ask the question, is that relevant to one of the flaws in the argument? Right? Is this fact relevant to a flaw? Not, is this exactly what I expected, but is that somehow relevant to, and then I'll, generalize the flaw of the argument. So the gaps, the flaws of the argument are my predictions here, but the answer choices are not just re-articulations of the gap or the flaw. Instead, the flaws are more general. The answer choices are very specific. They talk about really specific facts that would weigh on those more general flaws. So those are tricky. You have to look out for something that is, let's see, Ashiva says, I'm predicting what the correct answer choices will be. I predict the relevance of the answers on strengthen and weaken. The correct answer has to be relevant to, I'll frame it like this. If I say that the problem, the gap in the argument is that concept C was not well connected to concept D. The way that I would phrase a strengthened question is I would say the correct answer has to be relevant to connecting concepts C and D. And if it's a weakened question, I would say, well, the correct answer has to be relevant to disconnecting concepts C and D. But in what way, specifically, how will it connect or disconnect those concepts? I don't try to predict that because I'm just usually wrong. I'll connect it in one way and they'll find some other example to connect. And then I'm looking for the wrong thing. So I try to stay more high level on strengthen and weaken questions. I'm keyed in on the flaw of the argument, and I don't try to get any more specific than that. I have to kind of work backward from those. I take my first step by getting very strong understanding of the flaw. And then as I look at the answer choices, I'm sort of comparing them back to my prediction of the flaw and comparing their relevance to the flaw. But I'm not going all the way back to the original text of the argument because it's not presented in a way that helps you see the flaws. They are obscured. They're obscured by jumbled order of premises. They're obscured by paraphrases and difficulties in the grammatical structure. And so I sort all of that out before I get to the answer choices. All right, last question type that we'll talk about today, principle justify.
1 second, sorry to butt in.
Oh yeah, sorry, Andy. I forgot
No,
that you
you're
raised
good.
your hand.
So you explained the strengthen and weaken really well. My one question is like, how does that apply to evaluate? Because and when I get an evaluate the argument question, or like what, like by evaluate the argument, I think you mean like what question is like it could, and the answer is like what question is best to evaluate the argument. What would you want to
Correct.
know? So I like have been using, and I struggle on this. So this is why I'm really asking. I have been using like the power score method where it's like, you should get two different from the right answer. You should get two different, like one should be like strengthen or yes, and the other should like weaken it and be like no, and that's why you need to know. Is that how you do? What is different? Because I just was having a hard time understanding how you would apply this strategy to an evaluate question.
I actually think that this strategy simplifies the evaluate question. I'm familiar with PowerScore's method. I think it's sound. I use it, and I'll try to summarize it for everyone else here in a second. But I think that my strategy avoids the complexity of PowerScore's strategy because my analysis is a relevancy analysis more than it is a strengthen or weaken analysis. I'll figure out on a strengthen or weaken question. I'm content on my first pass to just say, is this relevant to the flaw? I'm not even concerned yet about whether it fixes the flaw or exacerbates the flaw. Just is it relevant to the flaw? And then if I have a couple answer choices left, I might decide that, well, yeah, this one's relevant because it strengthens. This one's relevant because it weakens. And therefore I pick A. I'm looking for the strengthener, not the weakener. So that's for the strengthen and weaken questions. For the evaluate question, the answer choices are questions. They don't strengthen or weaken the argument at all, not in and of themselves anyway. But if you're using my approach, it doesn't matter if it strengthens or weakens the argument because the question is, the critical question that you have to ask is this relevant to a flaw of the argument? Is this question in answer choice A relevant to one of the argument's flaws? And if it is, well, then we better address that question. That we need to know that to evaluate the argument. Whereas the wrong answers, we're going to say, that might be relevant to the conclusion, that might be relevant to the topic at hand, but it isn't relevant to a flaw of the argument. Okay, now let's go back and look at the more nuanced approach. Why does it work to ask whether it's relevant? It's because on an evaluate question, the correct answer is going to have this dynamic. If you answer the question one particular way, it will strengthen the argument. And if you answer the question the opposite way, it will weaken the argument. But the difficult thing is that it's not always the same. It's not always if you say yes, it strengthens, and no, it weakens. So for some, if you answer yes, that'll strengthen the argument. And if you answer no, that'll weaken the argument. There are other evaluate questions where it's the reverse. If you answer yes to the correct answer, that would weaken the argument. And if you answer no, that would strengthen the argument. But the key is this: opposite answers to the question point you in opposite directions toward your analysis of the argument. If we say yes, I'm with the argument. If we say no, I don't like the argument, or vice versa. But what can't be the case is that we say, well, if we say yes, that strengthens the argument. But if we say no, it makes no difference. It's totally irrelevant. Those answer choices where that's the dynamic, it tends to be the case that the statement is relevant to the conclusion, but not the argument. And so you look at it and you say, all right, well, if the answer is yes, that makes the conclusion more likely. But if the answer is no, it doesn't really affect the conclusion, because the conclusion wasn't just a random statement. It was a statement embedded within a logical form to support it. And on the evaluate questions, remember what I said before, it's not a fact question. It's not a fact-finding test. They're asking you about the logic, not just the truth of the conclusion. And so the correct answer is going to be one that's relevant to a flaw in the argument, not just relevant to the conclusion, not just relevant to the ideas presented in the argument, but relevant to a flaw in the argument. Okay, so our hour's up. I'm going to end it there, and I will pick it up on Tuesday and talk more about other question types and how to pre-phrase answers. And I do have some examples. Ashiba asked me for examples. I just, I have to kind of do those separately. You'll see why. Come next week and we'll do the examples together.
Hey, Keith, when is your when is the triple review class going to start?
Yeah, I wanted to mention that before we quit, because if you guys like the the materials that I have created and the philosophies that I espouse for the test, we have a class coming up that I teach with Jacob Feldman, and it starts on the 26th. And I will give you guys a link in the chat to sign up for the class. Hang on.
How long does that class run? Like if I'm planning to take the August exam, is that something where the class will be done beforehand? I mean, what's your opinion on that?
Yes, the class will be done before the August exam. I'm going to stop the recording because this recording will live on beyond the class. So hang on a second.